Welcome to New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. I'm your host, Sean. And rather than talk to you about the stuff that's going on in the world, because, well, we know what's going on with the Trump indictments, and we know that there's really no movement in the 2A cases, so let's continue on to something cooler. I found two new items that I think are kind of interesting, one of which I would love to see in the United States, but the only people that could possibly do it is Kalashnikov USA. And it's something that I knew was coming. But there's a news channel I follow on YouTube called Crux. And they brought this up specifically because, well, the Russians are trying to do their arms expo right now. And after the Ukrainian war, they're trying to show how great their arms are when they really aren't that great. And anyone who knows anything about AKs knows about the AK-12, and there's a lot of hype that was around this gun. And after seeing it in field trials and actually getting some examples smuggled to the U.S., specifically Brandon Herrera did a video on the AK-12, and so did Apolliner Tactical. And it has some very big shortcomings. Number one is that the handguard is polymer, and it has a tendency to lose zero if you have anything like a D-ball or like a PEC 14 on the front of it, so a night vision device, a laser optic. It loses zero because it shifts. As the barrel and the gas assembly heat up, it tends to warp and it tends to cause problems. Number two, its reliability, especially in the 2-round burst version of the AK-12, has been less than stellar in combat, and the Russian MOD has actually taken it back to the drawing board, and they've reproduced some things to make the gun better. One of the things they did is they shortened the barrel. So in the AK-19, what am I talking about with the AK-19? Everyone in the Western world uses 5.56 as their field rifle. If you're part of NATO, that's part of what being part of NATO means, is that we have standards on certain calibers. Now, the Poles right now use a 5.56 called the Barrel AK, which is really interesting, and we're just now seeing examples now in the United States imported by Roni. They're one of the manufacturers there, and I think there's another Polish one there, WBP. They're manufacturing these, and they're bringing in their version of the barrel to the United States. Now, what's interesting is thinking about the 7.62x39 in the AK, which is the round that most Americans like in the AK-47. But with the Russian exports and imports bans right now on ammunition specifically, ammunition's becoming harder to find, especially if you have something like I do in a 5.45. That used to come from anywhere in the Russian space, specifically Tula, which is a number one manufacturer of ammunition for the Russians. And getting 5.45, there's one of the bear companies, I think it's Royal Tiger or something like that, they're bringing in 5.45, but in very limited quantities. And this is because the Russians are using that as their service round. But the service round for all NATO's countries is 5.56. And to kind of market the AK-12 to the Americans or to the Western NATO countries as another option instead of M4 variants, they have changed the caliber of the AK-12 to the AK-19. And they changed its designation. Kalashnikov concern in Russia has. Now, what's interesting about this is that they didn't really change the rifle other than shorten it up. They made it more of what is called in the AK world an alpha. Because one of the primary concerns that they found in the Ukrainian war is running a suppressor of any kind for the 5.45 makes the gun really, really long and really, really unwieldy. Now, it's telling to see that the Russians fielding this new service rifle have no optics on their gun. They have no night vision. They have no optics of any kind. But when they're showing it on their websites, they're always showing it with optics that are Russian, or they're showing optics that are American that you can buy across the counter. And they're trying to show that it can indeed use optics. Now, if you are not familiar with the AK-12, its big claim to fame is that it is a modernized, an extremely modernized version of the AK-74M, and that it has the same barrel length, but it has some more modularity in its stock configuration that allows you to use forward grips, lights, lasers, the whole gamut of what we would get in the Western world with, say, an AR-15. They're trying to make the AK into the M4, basically, or the AR-15. And they're doing a pretty good job. But after the battles, what they've found is that there's some lacking in this gun. They found that the safety is really hard to use for an AK safety, so it's really stiff. And because of that 2-round burst, it's not something you can just fix right away in the field. You usually have to have some sort of armor or level to do this. They've also found that there's point of aim shifts. So the AK-12 actually has a rear sight that's closer to the shooter's face, closer to the rear of the gun. This gives it a longer sight radius. The M4 has the same capability. Thus, that's why it's always been okay. What American shooters don't realize is that the 5.45 and the 5.56, you can actually marry up the ballistics and they actually work very well. There's very little difference in the 5.45 and its flight trajectories as there is to a 5.56. There's very little pressure difference between a 5.45 and a 5.56. But since the 5.56 is now the common standard in the Western world, if you're trying to attract customers in the West, you would want to make it in the caliber that they can get more readily than they can the 7.62x39 or the 5.45, especially if you're in a war and you're hoarding the 5.45 for you doing what you're having to do in the war. So they've introduced the 5.56. And I knew this was coming, but Crux was the one that's showed this off, and I was like, well, okay. All they did, really, if you know anything about the AK-74, to change a 5.45 to a 5.56, you basically all you have to do is rebarrel it. The actual bolt, the bolt stem itself, will handle the pressure. It will handle the case very well. There's almost no real configuration change other than pressing the barrel in this. Now, with the AK-12 and now the AK-19, how you would put it in the gun is a little different because they've added 2 more rivets to the front trunnion of the AK-12 and the AK-19, and one of these is called a bump rivet. It's to help engage the bolt in a certain way so that it locks up better. But they also have some differences in the carrier design and the bolt design of the AK-12 and the AK-19 because they've updated the fire control system to give it better triggers, I guess is the best way to put it, versus like an AK-74M. The idea, again, with the Russian military was this is part of their, they had a modernization unit or a modernization sect that was trying to modernize their military hardware. And when they did this, the AK-12 was supposed to be one of the keystones to the upgrades. And if you're an AK guy like me, we've been always wanting to look at this. The AK-12 magazines are better because they have a window on them so you can actually see where the round count is. That doesn't help you much other than you get to see in the magazine that there's, half a mag instead of a full mag, because it still doesn't have a last round bolt hold open. Okay, this is one of the things the AK has as a shortcoming. It's because of the mass of the bolt carrier, usually, that they don't incorporate a last round bolt hole open, which is a Western thing. It's also because they believe that it keeps the action close, which means that less crap can get in it. Now, believe me, as much as I like to say the AK is pretty great and pretty robust and not as fallible as the M4, that's really not the case. You get a rock or a piece of dirt in the wrong place in an AK, it will stop just as rapidly as an M4 or an AR-15 or any of the Western rifles in the world. The difference is that this is prone to, how can I put it, in a polite way. Western people clean their guns. Russians aren't taught to clean their guns. They're a conscript army. So they're kind of more idiot-proof in that the gun will still cycle even if it's pretty fouled. That doesn't mean you don't have to clean it, because 7 and 6 for 5.45 specifically is corrosive, or the propellant is, and it will create corrosive salts in the barrel. and you usually rinse this out with water, and that breaks down the salts, and then you have to finish the cleaning operation. That is why they're looking at the 5.56. And it makes sense from another perspective that I was thinking about today when I saw that Crux had put this up, is that if you are fighting a war, protracted war against NATO countries, it makes sense that not only would you use 5.56, but that you would be able to have a rifle capable of 5.56 because you could live off the supply of your enemy if they were getting that ammunition. And Ukrainians right now are definitely getting that. So I could see why the Russians started thinking about this for a number of perspectives. One is market share. If you're trying to attract people and you think that you have the best weapons in the world, the Russians don't. As much as I love the AK, modern rifles that we have in the United States, M4 rifles, AR-15 rifles, SIG, MCX, Veritas, or however the hell you say it, the Spear, any of them are capable of performing or outperforming accurately against this rifle. But if you're a country that doesn't have an endless supply of cash and you want a gun that is for a conscript army, this makes a lot of sense, especially after they've taken it back to the drawing board and fixed those issues they've seen in warfare, because then they have a better idea like we did after the first Gulf War. You know, there was some changes made to the M16 that filtered out to the American civilian market after the first Gulf War that made it dramatically improved from what it was. You know, and let's not even talk about the British L-86. The L-86 had so many short-falling pieces, parts in it that the British had to take it to HK, Heckler Koch, and they had to basically redesign the gun and rebuild it to make it into what it is now, which is an 11-pound 5.56 service rifle. And if you think about that, 11 pounds, and you're not able to change its bolt configuration so that a left-handed shooter can use it, it is what it is, and the British tell you, well, you're a lefty, you're going to learn how to shoot right-handed. Well, that doesn't always work. And if you think about the bullpup configuration, you kind of want the comfort of knowing that the round isn't going to hit you in the mouth every time you fire it, especially when this is a hot piece of brass. So looking at something like the AK, which has a tendency for left-handed shooters to actually be okay. You know, they don't have a problem with it. They're usually okay with it. They have to adjust to the ergonomics of it. But usually left-handed shooters are okay with AKs. What I think is really telling, though, is that the Russians are trying to sell this and try to sell their new weapons, their new tanks, their new planes, because they're trying to get capital for what they have. You know, you can't run a war without having capital or have investment to build your own weapons, unless you're the United States, where we have what seems to be an endless supply of capital to support the military-industrial complex of the United States. Now, with that in mind, the other thing I found today, and I have to give a shout-out to Rob Ski at AKOU. He's going to be doing a video on this rifle at some point, and I think it's intriguing. It's the MK, or the Mark 22 new sniper system that Barrett is making for our snipers, the United States snipers. Now, this rifle will be, because it's made in America and because it's a bolt-action rifle, will probably be available for purchase by American shooters. Now, it comes in 3 calibers. It comes in .308 or 7.62 by 51. It comes in what they call 338 Norma Magnum and 300 Norma Magnum. Now, I've not looked into the ballistics, but if it's anything close to a 300 Winchester Magnum, I know the 300 Winchester Magnum is extremely good. Now, the Magnums are in 10-round configurations for their magazine, and so is the 308. The difference is in barrel twist. In the 308 or the 7.62 diameter bore, that would be the 300 or the 7.62 by 51. It's a 1-in-8 twist, so it's a tighter twist for heavier bullets. In the 300, it's got a 26-inch barrel versus a 20-inch barrel. Now, what's cool about this is this looks like a modular chassis system. When you look at the butt stock of this gun, you can adjust comb for cheek comb. You can adjust length of pull. And that's an important thing for American shooters who have gotten to the point where we try to make the rifle fit the shooter, not the other way around. We're not Russians. We're not Eastern in any way. It also looks like it has a modular trigger pack, which allows you to change triggers to your liking. It also looks like you can adjust those. The other thing it has is a pistol grip that looks very reminiscent of an AR-15. So how many different AR-15 grips are out there? To make the gun fit the shooter, this makes sense. It has a monolithic 1913 rail across the top of it, a fluted barrel with a muzzle device that is very easily and readily adaptable to use a suppressor, and then it has M-LOK slots at the normal places that you'd want them to have. What's really interesting is it has a detachable box magazine that looks a lot like what Magpul is producing now for the AR-10. So you'd probably be able to use an AR-10 magazine in the 7.62x51 version of this. I'm imagining that these magazines that they're going to make are probably by Magpul, but in the Magnum configuration. So they're going to be wider, but a little stouter, so to speak, to allow that belted cartridge, because that's usually what they have. Again, I'd have to look at the cartridge, and I'm having hell trying to find the 300 Norma, because that's the one I'm more interested in. I'd be more interested in this rifle if it actually had 300 Winchester mag, because I have ballistics already figured out for a lot of those rounds. It looks like you can pop it into two pieces like you can in AR. You can change the top rail itself to something that would be more your taste if later down the road you wanted it. It looks like it has the slots and everything in the places you would want them that you wouldn't need to. What's interesting to me, though, is it looks like it has a place where you could unscrew two screws on the handguard that would allow you to pull the barrel nut and barrel out at one time. If that's the case, and the barrels have that sleeve like the AR-15 or the AR-10s do, that allow the bolt to go in there and it's already pre-headspace based on the nut that's there, that means that this would be a caliber conversionable type of gun. Now, I know snipers don't want to mess with their guns, but there's a lot of people in the United States that would. And if you could go from 308 to like a 300 or a 338, why wouldn't you have that barrel conversion kit? Okay? Because that means you could take one for deer hunting, light deer hunting, a 308. And then when you want to go hunt for like an elk or a moose, now you have a 338. Now there's a dream that every American shooter has about being a pure marksman, which some of us can pull off and some of us can't. That this probably makes up for a lot of your shortcomings. This gun is very capable, from what I've seen already, of printing that sub MOA at 100 yards that everybody's looking for, which means it's going to be very precise at extremely long distances. But that only matters if you're a shooter capable of doing that. There's a lot of people, a lot of press in the United States around people that are looking at these guns and saying, I want a sub MOA gun. Great. I understand. That means it should be as deadly accurate as possible. But are you actually capable of doing it? There are a few shooters I've met. Not to toot my own horn, I think I'm one of those that I can actually do it. My buddy Mark is. I'm pretty sure my buddy Dexton could, given some time, especially on the platform, because he'd have to get more familiar with different platforms than some of us other guys who just have the basics down so much that once you get on a gun, you have the mechanics that keep you in that sub MOA if the gun is very capable of it. And that's something that comes with a lot of rounds downrange and a lot of long-range shooting. And this is one of those guns that I think is just very intriguing, and especially if Robski, who's gotten wicked into, he was a scout sniper for the Army. I think he still is. But he's very much into long-range shooting, and he does matches with his daughter, Veronica, and they're pretty freaking wicked. Like, his daughter is very young, and she's able to hit it like 750 yards reliably with the guns they're using, and they're using some vintage guns to do this in some matches. and that's impressive. But they're also going to schools to where they're shooting with some of the best guys that can teach you how to be that guy. And I've never had that. I just had some really old school shooters that were very into precision bench rest shooting. And they spent a lot of time ladder loading to get to those hand loads to make sure that the round they were using in that rifle was squeezing every bit of performance out of the round and as well out of the rifle that they could for their value. So, we will see what this produces. And I bet you this gun is probably going to MSRP for close to 10 grand. That Barrett doesn't make crap, and they're not listing the price, which tells me automatically you're looking easily 10 grand for this gun. The available colors, they're showing black. Well, they're only showing FDE right now for this, but this is very new in its provenance, meaning that this was just adopted, I believe, by the military, which means that give it 5 years and we'll start seeing the prices on these guns going down because they'll have learned more and found ways of producing it cheaper. Just like when the Barrett M82 came out, there for a while that gun was, 20 grand, and now you can start seeing prices south of 7,000 for a used one. And that's what I see happening with this gun also. So, there are bright spots in the 2A. The new stuff that's coming out. Every time I think I'm not going to see a collectible gun that I'm interested in, then something like this comes out, or like the AK-19, or I don't see the AK-19 coming here unless Kalashnikov USA finds a way to somehow get the tooling from Russia. Because of import bans and because of our relationship with Russia right now, I don't see us getting that. Now, what Kalashnikov USA has said, though, is that they're going to produce AK-101 or 100 series in 5.56, and that is something that I know they can do, because Bulgaria has been doing it for a long time with, the Bulgarian AKs are Arsenal AKs. Arsenal, I have an Arsenal, an SLR 106, and it is in 5.56. It is one of my favorite rifles. And so I can see them producing a 100 series AK in 5.56, and it makes a lot of sense in the United States. If you already have an AR-15, which most of us in the 2A community should, if you don't, you should probably go get one. But you'll start stocking that ammunition, and once you stock that, now you don't have to stock 7.62 by 39. So I'm one of those guys that's an AK purist that still likes to have all the calibers, so I have 5.45, 7.62 by 39, and 5.56 now in the AK world. And the one I think is the most pleasant to shoot, honestly, is the 5.45, but as trying to get the ammunition as of late, I'm kind of sticking to what I have, which is probably about, 4,000 to 6,000 rounds. I don't want to use that and without having some sort of stock that I can replace that with, because I love the cartridge so much. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Like, share, subscribe, comment, be great.